of opposition, and this outlines where we're going to challenge Labour.
Nigel Farage unveils Reform UK's election pledges. We'll have the detail from what Reform calls not a manifesto and tot up the figures. Labour has accused the Conservatives of double counting after the Chancellor appeared to suggest manifesto savings on welfare had already been announced. Benjamin Netanyahu has disbanded his war cabinet after the centrist opposition leader walked out. Also this evening.
The other option is you shoot Gap, but of course in that environment, would you want to be using a rifle in a built-up area on a dark Friday night?
The National Farmers Union defends police who used a car to ram an escaped cow. The BBC investigation has found evidence that children with special educational needs have been bullied, mocked and physically abused by some members of staff at a school on Merseyside. An undercover reporter for Panorama secretly filmed some of the incidents. The school, Life Wirral, is currently closed after it was made aware of the evidence. It said it took allegations of misconduct seriously and 5 members of staff have been suspended. Panorama's Ruth Clare reports.
Life Wirral, an independent sports school on Merseyside, advertises itself as a place where children can reach their full potential. But an undercover reporter for BBC Panorama found a very different environment. She volunteered there for nearly 7 weeks, helping out with sports activities. Here's Paul Hamill, one of the senior leaders in the school, describing how he had fantasised about killing one of his pupils, as he put it, drowning the child in a bath like a kitten, and that the boy had overheard him.
The worst thing the fucking child that got away with, 40 gone, Thomas Rick Baths, and this is that. Was to drown him in the bath like a kitten.
Would like to what?
Was to drown him in the bath like a kitten.
The BBC wrote to Paul Hamill. He did not respond. Other members of staff were filmed grabbing children, putting them in dangerous headlocks and wrestling them to the ground. The CEO of Life Wirral, Alistair Severamuta, tells the undercover reporter he used a police-style restraint on a pupil. He says he nailed him because the boy who was lashing out ignored his 10-second warning.
He hit the floor faster than he did, right, because I just did one pressure point and he was gone. Yeah.
How'd you do that?
It's just like he just brings his arms and you lock his arms in. And once you've locked yourself out, if I get you on the arm and lock you in,
Yeah.
he hits the floor like that. Like that.
Lawyers for Mr Severamuta said he denies ever using inappropriate force on or behaving aggressively towards a pupil. The school is independent, but because the children have education, health and care plans, the local authority pays the fees. Since it opened in 2021, it has received £2.2 million from Borough Council. The Department for Education has confirmed the school is currently closed while the local authority investigates. It says it will take enforcement action, including permanent closure, should the school try to reopen.
Panorama undercover school cruelty in the classroom on BBC One at 8 o'clock tonight and on iPlayer afterwards. The Reform UK leader Nigel Farage has laid out his party's election plans in a document billed as a contract with voters rather than a manifesto. Pledges, which were launched at an event in South Wales, include a freeze on all non-essential immigration, raising income tax personal allowance to £20,000, the scrapping of carbon net zero measures, and an extra £17 billion a year for the NHS. Economists call the plans Lustros on steroids. Political correspondent Damien Grammaticus reports from Merthyr Tydfil.
This launch event was designed in every way to distinguish Reform UK from the other major parties. Its offer is billed as a contract, not a manifesto, as it says those are never delivered on. It was unveiled in a run-down sports hall on a housing estate in the Welsh Valleys, not a fancy corporate venue. Damp staining the outer walls from broken gutters, render peeling off in places. A few dozen people living nearby emerged to see what the fuss was about. Farage swept past in a Range Rover. Kept outside while, for the live television cameras, he laid out Reform UK's offer. Freeze on non-essential immigration, 20,000 new frontline police officers, catering life in prison and drug dealing, 0 NHS waiting lists, GP appointment in 3 days, or you can get a voucher to get private treatment, public holidays on St George's Day and St David's Day, and many more. Mr Farage said it won't be paid for by increasing taxes.
The most innovative thing, policy that we put out in here is to raise the level at which people start paying tax to £20,000. 7 million people out of the tax system altogether. A devilishly complicated tax system.
In fact, he's offering more tax cuts. Inheritance tax will only be levied on estates worth over £2 million. Stamp duty on properties worth £750,000. Frontline NHS staff will be exempt from basic rate income tax for 3 years. There are tax cuts for businesses too, especially small businesses. My colleague Alex Forsyth asked how realistic this was.
Some of the stuff in here, you accuse other parties of broken promises, but isn't this really a list of unrealistic promises, a wish list that you never plan to deliver on?
It is a promise. This is what we're going to campaign for over the course of the next 5 years. These are the principles, these are the issues. I said at the very start, we are not going to be in government, but we are going to provide a voice of opposition.
Mr Farage says it can be funded by making government more efficient, scrapping carbon net zero policies, reforming the Bank of England, and getting 1 million people off benefits and into work. Rather than debate the details, his aim is to tap into a deep vein of discontent and, he says, create a movement that can challenge the status quo.
The independent economics research organisation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, argues that a reform government would struggle to raise the money for the tax cuts and spending it's proposing. Economics correspondent Andy Verity has been looking at the numbers.
The Reform Party's contract has big round numbers, great for the IPOM factor, but on closer inspection, too round to be rigorous. The IFS notes it promises to boost economic growth by cutting taxes by £90 billion, along with £150 billion of cuts to debt interest, public services and benefits. Reform UK says public spending has jumped by £200 billion since 2019, suggests that's down to waste, and then claims it could save £50 billion by cutting spending on quangos and arm's-length bodies without anyone noticing any harm. Actually, public spending jumped from £992 billion in 2019 to £1,172 billion in 2020 because of pandemic-related support and, more recently, government help with energy bills. It's now expected to fall as a share of the economy. Far from having too many staff, public services such as the NHS have far too few to meet surging demand as baby boomers grow older. When Boris Johnson's government tried a bonfire of the quangos in 2022, the number merged, but the savings were negligible. Paying less interest to banks on all the reserves they're required to hold at the Bank of England has been rejected by its current governor, but has some support from the bank's former chief economist, Charlie Bean, and others. The official rate wasn't paid on all reserves before 2009, and since interest rates started rising 3 years ago, it's become very expensive. But even if you paid no interest at all, it would save at most £23 billion, not 30 to 40 billion. And it would carry a risk that the Bank of England loses control of interest rates.
Reform says that its plan to scrap net zero energy commitments will save the government £30 billion a year. With his assessment of the policy, here's our climate editor Justin Rowland.
The total cost of reaching net zero is eye-watering. The Office of Budget Responsibility has calculated it will come to some £1.3 trillion. Yes, trillion. Perhaps that shouldn't be surprising. We're talking about a fundamental transformation of the country's energy system. But the figures aren't quite as frightening as they might seem. First off, a significant share of that total will come from the private sector. It is itching to build solar and wind farms if it could only get the planning permission. And Reform has left the potential savings in increased efficiency and lower energy costs from all this new low-carbon technology out of its calculations. The Climate Change Committee, the government's watchdog on the climate issue, reckons by 2050 net zero will be generating an £11 billion a year saving and should deliver a net benefit in the longer term. And there are a couple of other points to consider. Governments are obliged to work towards net zero. That was made law with a huge majority back in 2019. The Reform Party would need to strike down the Climate Change Act to undo that. Then there are the commitments we've made as part of the UN climate negotiations. The UK could turn its back on these, but there'd be a cost in terms of the country's international reputation. One final thing to bear in mind, the cost to the world of not tackling climate change, which scientists and economists agree would be huge.
The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has accused the Conservatives of proposing unfunded tax cuts after the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt appeared to suggest that election pledges on welfare spending were announced last year. The Conservative manifesto promises to fund tax breaks by cutting £12 billion a year from spending on benefits by 2029. Labour said Mr Hunt's comments showed the money had already been spent, which the Tories deny. Here's our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman.
Spending on health and disability benefits has soared since 2019 and is forecast to keep growing. That makes this a significant policy challenge for both main parties, but in one particular sense it's crucial for the Conservatives.